Thank you, Jason. Just before we start, I should probably say that I was to link with the previous session. I was very fortunate to be in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr for the final performance of Galwad, and there was a moment that I'll never forget, which is where one of the lead characters gives a speech that has to combine both the kind of bleakness of the future that we all face if we carry on as we are, with also a sense of real hope for the future, and it is done absolutely brilliantly. I will never forget that moment. So what we're going to do today is something a little like Galwad, which is we're going to take stock about where we are now, and we're going to think about where we might go in the future. So I'd like us to have a kind of two-part discussion, I guess. First, thinking about where we've got to and what we now know, and then, I guess, picking up on Sophie's challenge at the beginning, which is to think about where we should go in terms of thinking about the well-being of future generations. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel. On it, we have Andrew Chitty, who many of you will know. I'm not going to give you all of Andrew's titles because he's got loads. He's just the kind of creative industry supremo in the research councils. So we have Helge Svela, and apologies for my terrible Norwegian pronunciation.
It's good.
Helge is CEO of Media City Bergen, which is one of the probably the most mature media clusters in Europe. They've been going for quite a while, and I think we've got an awful lot to learn from their experience. We have Josh Seipel from the University of Sussex, but also key for this panel, a member of the Policy and Evidence Centre, who has access to, I guess, a lot of research and insights about where we've got to and where we might go. So, and Marlen Komorowski, friend and colleague from Clwstwr and Media Cymru, but also an expert on media clusters across Europe. So I'll get started, I think, by asking us to take stock. We've now done quite a few Beyond conferences. At the beginning, this was all a bit of a new idea, this doing R&D and innovation in the creative industries. We've now done it for a while. So I'm just wondering what we've learned from that. So Andrew, I guess you're in quite a good position to kick us off here. You've had an overview. I mean, the Creative Industries Clusters program is not yet done, but it's mature enough, I think, that we've got a lot of data that's now emerging. What have we learnt so far?
I think we've learnt loads, actually. Some of it which we kind of expected to learn. So by, I suppose, bringing a new kind of articulation of how industry and universities work together, because I think there's been change, whilst a lot of its focus and a lot of the achievements have been about industry accessing and engaging with the research community. I think the more subtle shift is the universities have changed and architected themselves to be more receptive to that and more capable of doing it. So I think we learned a lot of stuff that we expected to learn, which is what works, what doesn't, how do you do that, how do you make that, what kind of things do, say, SMEs who find it hard to have R&D with long timescales. If they work with, universities, how can you create facilities or frameworks or labs and things? So I think there's lots of good stuff, lots of good stuff come out of that. I think the other thing we've learned, which I'd love to say we predicted at the start, but frankly we didn't, was how these partnerships can take on a life of their own in their place. So it's nothing to do with the initial, well, it is to do with the initial money that's given by to encourage the R&D, but all the clusters are doing so much more than that, and they've become key delivery mechanisms for very different things, and very different things in Northern Ireland to here in Cardiff. Very different things in as part of the Edinburgh City deal to other places. So that, I think, what we didn't really predict was that, in the words of one of our advisory group at UKRI, created a landing strip for other people's money. And it had a very powerful amplifying effect. So you've all done brilliantly in bedding yourselves in a way, to become those kind of, so that we didn't, we've learned it's happened, we've got lots and lots of numbers, we're always shouting about it.
Yeah.
But it's actually, we should step back, and that's a remarkable thing that we didn't predict that the clusters would have got this far in this only, 4.5 years. It's actually only 4 years, really, since we did the first Beyond, when we launched the clusters program.
And is there anything that you would, knowing what you now know, is there anything that you wish you had done or wish you hadn't done early on when this whole program was being devised and developed and thought through?
There's nothing, from my point of view, that I think there was a massive missed opportunity. Because I think that what it's been is kind of slightly the opposite. If more things have come out of it than we thought, so rather than hark back to things that might not have happened. I guess and this is perhaps a very current thing, is thinking that success and data would speak for itself, that obviously this is a thing that works, and therefore obviously people want to get behind the same mechanism in the long term. That's perhaps a little naive. Okay,
interesting. Might come back to that.
Yeah.
Josh, talking of data and evidence, Policy and Evidence Centre, you've had a kind of overview, I guess, of all the work that's been going on over the last few years. I mean, what would you say that you have learnt, really, in the 4 years that the programme's been going and the Policy and Evidence Centre's been going?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're learning more and more about creative industries R&D is we're learning about the strength and the level and the activities that are going on within the creative industries relating to R&D. But I think one of the things which I've really picked up is the depth of things that are going on which are really innovative but may not necessarily be being picked up in official measures and official statistics and things like that. And so I think one of the things that we've really been doing with our evidence gathering and evidence sort of bringing together ways to try to understand the ways in which the R&D that is happening is much broader than sort of the very classical definition of R&D that a lot of people tend to think of about, people in white coats sitting around in a lab bench. And obviously, at this point, we're sort of preaching to the converted, everyone here. But I think being able to make a robust case to say, actually, this is a real thing. This is tech. This is, we're seeing real phenomena. Money being invested into things, and we've got a piece of work that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks that's looking at Createch, where our main finding is that Createch companies are tech companies. Like, they're just like tech companies. They grow like tech companies, they act like tech companies, and yes, there's some differences in various things, but fundamentally, if you're looking at growth as something which is currently part of the political discourse, Createch is a real way of generating that, and that's a completely R&D intensive way, but often in ways that might not necessarily be captured in traditional metrics. And being able to push that as a narrative is something that we think is really important for things like R&D tax credits and things like that to really support the creative industries to be able to invest in these types of R&D going forward.
Do you, you talk about tech, and obviously a lot of R&D is around tech. I guess one of the challenges that we faced early on was that people assumed it was very, very techy R&D. It really was people in white coats. And that put an awful lot of people in the creative sector off. They kind of thought, well, that's not for us. That's really for somebody else to do. Do we need to do a better job of, because in a way the tech bit's the easy bit because we know that's an R&D space. Do we need to do a better job of talking about R&D that's not necessarily about tech, or is about adapting tech, or those sorts of things?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the things that our piece that's coming out quite soon is going to be showing is that companies in the Createch space, they spend their money not on kit, but on people. It's on staff time, it's on employees, it's on freelancers, and so the fundamental profile of spending on R&D in these sectors is much more on, it's not necessarily just about getting the fanciest whatever bits of very expensive kit that you might need if you're talking about, say, a biotech company. Yeah. But it's actually about being able to invest in this. So I think part of what we're trying to actually build the argument for is exactly this, that it's not just about the machinery, it's not actually just about the technology, it's about knowing how to use that technology. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing which we're trying to sort of push out a little bit more and trying to make that case. This is valid R&D, it just doesn't look like the way that people tend to have in their preconceptions.
Yeah, so what you might need is the storytellers who can then turn the tech into something. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So Marlen, thinking about this from a European point of view, I mean, you've studied media clusters in particular across Europe. What in the UK, what can we learn from that? I mean, what are some of the insights that you think that we should be thinking about to take what we're doing in the UK forward?
Well, first of all, I think it can definitely be highlighted that the idea of a creative economy and the creative and cultural industry is kind of rooted from the UK still. So in that kind of thinking of seeing this as an important part of a local economy and local economic strength, that's really UK based. However, it has taken quite a long time to see some of the more traditional funding programs like from UKRI also to stepping into that kind of sectors, which I see is happening in other countries already a little bit earlier. So there are strengths which we have already here in the UK and with this localized idea, but also still points where there is a need to catch up. And then basically what I found is that it is becoming more and more competitive between different local hubs all across the EU, but also internationally. So we see that you cannot see the creative industries and specific subsectors of this as something that is just rooted locally and can work locally, but it always needs an international outreach. So a global, local hub, basically. So if we want to compete with areas like Silicon Valley having as many very important movies being created, like in Hollywood, two of the biggest media clusters, of course. I'm not saying we need a Silicon Valley in the UK or in Europe, but we need our own local strength to compete against these international forces. And that's something where I really appreciate programs like Strength in Places, which tries to achieve that, but also with an international outreach, which is very important. And I see internationally a lot of examples where this is done very well in other European countries, like, for example, Bergen as well.
Any particular examples that spring to mind about some bits of good practice that we can learn from, or some examples that you think would be useful for us to think about?
I do live in Berlin, so I always like to use that as a best practice example. And Berlin is very well known, probably also among the audience here, as a very creative place. Lots of buzz, lots of going on, and very attractive for people to move to Berlin and work on projects, lots of investments being there. So if it comes to startup culture, that's quite unique, and that's something that I don't see here that much in Cardiff. How to create this? Do we want to replicate something like Berlin here? Maybe every local hub needs to find its own strength. And I see building on the path-dependent roots of where Cardiff is coming from at the moment, which is very much rooted in the audiovisual sector, is something much more important. So finding a niche for each and every single place, it can create competitive advantages and is something very important. So yes, Berlin, very good example, but maybe we shouldn't strive to be like other places. Maybe we should strive to become here in Cardiff or at the different places in the UK to become something unique, something that is a unique competitive advantage compared to other regions in the EU or worldwide.
Okay, and I guess that applies to all regions, I guess, in the UK, in their own way. Helge, Media City Bergen, you've been going for, I think, over 10 years now. It's one of the most mature kind of cluster organisations that we've got in Europe. It's very highly regarded. You've won all kinds of awards for being brilliant in all sorts of ways, and I've certainly experienced that, having visited it. I mean, it really is, you really get the sense that, you know, you've been doing this for a while now, and those collaborations between key broadcasting partners, between university and also between industry, large and small, is really living and thriving. But what can we learn from you, do you think?
Well, I think Marlen makes a very good point. You should play on your strengths. And I think our cluster started off as from the main commercial broadcaster in Norway, TV2. When they started, they didn't have the kind of money or the culture that the public service broadcaster had. So they had to try to find smarter solutions, cheaper solutions to problems. And I think that's one of my key takeaways, is that if you're going to do R&D, you have to solve a problem that someone is having. It doesn't matter if you have like a great solution if it doesn't really solve a problem for anyone. So I think a lot of the companies that have been very successful coming out of Bergen, they have really identified in the newsroom or in the TV broadcast system, they identified a real problem, and I thought, okay, we're going to solve this. Take Vista T, for instance, which is now maybe the world's largest company for visuals on TV. The story goes, and I wasn't there, so I don't know if it's true, but the story goes that they were broadcasting this breaking news event, and it was like a plane that had fallen down, or a helicopter or something, and it was the coast of Norway, so it was like really raining and foggy, and basically you couldn't see anything. So the guy, head of the newsroom, said, "But we're not making radio here. We need some sort of graphics." And that became the start of Vista T, apparently. So there was a problem. We need graphics. Okay, let's go out and solve that problem. And the second thing I would say that's really in the heart of our cluster is collaboration, and that people know each other and they trust each other. And again, that comes from the same kind of culture that started in TV2, and they've created various spin-off companies like Vista T, like Fun Group, like Vimon, and all these people, they kind of work together, or they know each other afterwards. They've met up, they come to our events, and the relationships are renewed and sustained, and new people are brought in. So when Vista T goes into a new market or goes to a new TV station and to deliver the graphics, they say, okay, we can supply you with this part of the solution, but you're going to need this and this. Do you have companies that you work with, or should we bring some of the companies that we like to work with and that has products that are 100% integrated with ours? So, of course, a lot of the customers say, like, great, we'll just take the whole package. So in a way, we become a one-stop shop for the customer, but in reality, there are many vendors within the shop, each selling their product that all fit together in the value chain.
I mean, there's a lot to think about that. I mean, VisRT, I should just say, if most of you, if you haven't heard of VisRT, you've almost certainly seen their work. It's right across British broadcasting in all kinds of forms, and they are truly a global leader. And you know, their growth has been a story, I guess, one of the stories to come out of Media City Bergen. I suppose in some ways we're taking stock. That's the easy bit. The difficult bit, which is where I want to ask a slightly more challenging question, is to think about some of the things that we've been talking about today. I mean, Sophie challenged us all at the beginning of today to think about how everything we do now has to have the well-being of future generations in mind. Now, in a world in which there's no doubt that for political reasons, many of us have kind of ridden the tide of creative industries, the idea that this is a growing sector, you know, where we can ride growth all the way up to lots of new jobs and all those kinds of things. But in a world where growth comes at a huge price, how do we need to rethink that? I mean, Andrew, have we created a monster of kind of this, you know, fantastically growing sector that actually is going to make the world a worse place because of?
It's interesting, isn't it?
Because
I think really, so as Marlen said, that the creative industries idea, the kind of UK version, which isn't quite the same as media. Yeah. In fact, it's quite distinctly different. Yeah. So there's lots of bit in. We might want to look at, rather than looking at the bits that we often talk about in those 9 sectors of the creative industries, we might want to start thinking about craft. We might want to thinking about publishing and things like this, which perhaps throw a different perspective on some of the future things. But have we created a monster? Well, we haven't created a monster that's the size of maritime transport. You know, that's for sure. And I thought today's been really, really interesting, saying is the creative sector's contribution to solving contributing to the climate transition or carbon transition, is it best about decarbonising ourselves, which we should do, but even if we do brilliantly, it's not going to make that much difference. I spend a lot of time working with the kind of, the people who are trying to decarbonise the electricity, and power motive, electric drive kind of trains. These are big problems. Or is it about contribution to envisaging the world as a better place to live with different values, which I think we've heard a lot about today. And I think it's both. So for the CoStar thing that I announced yesterday, we talked about building these labs, but the bit that we're going to ask a call for soon is around a foresight both technology, audience, and carbonisation foresight unit for the creative industries, because I think it's been clear today there's a lot going on, but coordinating it and maybe keeping a data set that allows us to, to study that. So we definitely need that, but I'm still really intrigued about what we do to contribute to the change rather than through the form, not just through reducing our energy use in line with everyone else.
Yeah, and the second part, I suppose, I mean, the first part you could see how you could build that into a key performance indicator. The second part, that's tougher. How do you get a KPI for that?
But big, right? Some of the younger storytellers we're thinking, I think there's that generational change as well, where we have a generation which is not us, who think about these, as we've heard today, think about these things differently.
Yeah. Josh, I know that at the PEC you've worked with Julie's Bicycle, who were on a panel earlier, who obviously are really thinking about all of these things. I mean, what are some of the learnings that have come out of that?
Yeah. So actually tomorrow, the PEC and Julie's Bicycle are launching a report that we've done with them. And it's a really exciting piece of work, because what we're trying to do in this piece is for the first time to really map out all the way across all of the 9 creative industry subsectors, Andrew, in line with what you were saying, kind of mapping out what's going on, what the challenges are, and how they're distinct, because fundamentally the issues in IT and software are going to be very, very different from the issues in craft. And indeed, the way that we conceive of these problems is going to be very different. And so that's part of the work. But I think the other thing which sort of comes from the work that's come out as part of this research is, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of appetite for sustainability. And one of the things I was looking today at some of the data from our new Creative Radar survey, which we're going to be launching next year, where we're asking questions about sustainability, and virtually everyone in the survey says, we think sustainability is part of our core values. So, people think that, these are, sustainability values are baked in a lot of cases to people's ideals of what they see their organizations as being, which I think is really interesting. And I think what this new piece with Julie's Bicycle tomorrow is sort of showing is there's a lot of interest for it, and there's a lot of things where people are doing individual activities, they're coming up with new innovative solutions, but they're often doing that without a framework. They're doing it sort of on their own. They're not necessarily doing it under a broader window, or, I wouldn't even say regulation in terms of government regulation, but in terms of, here's a plan, here's something you can do. People are sort of making it up as they go along because they're interested in it. And so the challenge, as we argue in the report, is to establish for sustainability the systems, the resources, and sort of the ideas and kind of the frameworks to enable this type of innovation to go on, to allow both this first issue, as Andrew was saying, around sort of decarbonization, but then also to realize that actually possibly the value added may not necessarily be in swapping to more renewable energy suppliers for our computers, but actually, as has been coming up today again and again, the stories that we tell and the social impacts of the things that are coming out of the sector.
And how do we build, I suppose, the net zero goals into the way we think about innovation? Clearly there are things that we can do to reduce carbon footprint. Is that a separate track, or do we build it into the very nature of the kind of innovation that we want to invest in?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, actually. I think there's some things that can be done which are more concrete measures that are that can be, as you said, that can be KPI'd, and there's some stuff that can be baked in there. And I think there's other stuff that can be made as targets that can be more community-based, can be more locally led, can be trying to envisage sustainability in a very broad sense, even beyond necessarily a net zero perspective, which is obviously talking about carbon, but things even, biodiversity and waste and all these other things that don't show up in the net zero agenda. And so I think being able to think about those things in the whole are important, but at the same time, I think it's also possibly a bit difficult to sort of say, well, here's a couple of targets. I think it's better, there's a lot to be done in terms of, I think, systems and in terms of providing support and providing resources for organizations and people to be able to achieve what they have the potential to deliver on for delivering sustainability within these sectors.
Thanks, Josh. Marlen, I know that you've written about the whole notion of value, and I know you've grappled a lot with KPIs and just thinking about, how do you measure the success of all this? And in some ways, the economic KPIs are a little bit easier. It's things we all know. It's jobs created. It's it's GVA. It's all of those sorts of measures. But how do we start to think about a value system that incorporates social goals, well-being, inclusion, sustainability, all of those kinds of things? I mean, what's your thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. So for our new program around Media Cymru, we see as sustainability not only environmental sustainability, but also social fairness, as well as internationalization and the economic development. So similar to the Future Generations Act, we think it's these different pillars. It's not only about environmental sustainability and the culture itself. And what I basically learned, and something that I would say here as a little appeal to everyone here who is a creative or working for a company in the creative industries, is that if it comes to these goals, it's often seen as a cost. So people see, oh, I have to do something, I have to reach net zero, I have to put in money, it costs me something to get there. It costs me something to be more inclusive, and they think, okay, how can I achieve this? And it's all basically a loss of money. But what I kind of saw happening while trying to measure and what's happening, if you bring in innovation into the mix here, it's kind of a reframing from a cost to an actual investment that on the long term also creates profit. And if you invest then in innovative solutions, create new processes that are environmentally sustainable or that are more inclusive, that create more diversity across your workforce or for your audiences or your users, then this idea of it's costly to do all of these steps becomes into something that creates a return in the end and is overall value creation for the business itself. And there is quite a lot of interesting research that already in itself, some of these new thinking, new processes create value, much harder to measure though.
Yep.
And also much more on the long term. It's about really sustainability on the long term. You cannot see, I create this, I get more profit tomorrow from it. It's something that is quite often much harder to measure. But still, this kind of reframing from a cost to an investment is something that I think is really an appeal that can create change in culture, in how we see these kind of goals that we all want to achieve.
So it's a new kind of accountancy, really, one that has a whole range of different kind of values in terms of what it measures.
And it goes also beyond greenwashing, for example, or pinkwashing, where we see, okay, I have to reach net zero by tomorrow, I'm buying carbon certificates. If you invest it into new processes as an R&D process, making innovation that creates this, then it also has a payoff for you on the long term.
Talking about sustainability, and moving to Norway, which is a country that shows a very different path, I think, to the UK. We both found oil in the North Sea, but you did it in a certain way that allowed you to kind of invest in renewables, and I believe that 100% of the supply now in the Norwegian grid is renewable energy. Is that right?
Well, Norway is blessed with lots of hydro, so it's like more than 100 years ago, we kind of built a lot of dams that still are giving us a lot of the hydroelectricity we need. But I would like to kind of scope out the whole sustainability issue, if I may, and talk a little bit about also the sustainability of democracy, which is the foundation of all our other sustainability goals, you can say. And I really think that media and media tech can play a vital part in that. You can see the cost of fake news, whereas if it's in the coverage of the war in the Ukraine or on global warming, fake news and deliberate disinformation and misinformation has a real cost and it's a real threat to our society. And I really believe that the media and the media tech industry can see this as a challenge, as a problem that needs to be solved, and that there's can be a form of also like an economic initiative to kind of tackle these kind of problems. And maybe it's difficult for like a startup at first to kind of see, okay, it's this problem we're going to solve, but who's going to be the buyer? And I think maybe there, clusters, a clusters organization can take an important part in kind of helping carrying those projects up with like public funding and stuff like that. And I really believe that it is one of the biggest issues of our time, and it affects also the trust in government and all these other problems that we are discussing.
It's a really interesting point, and actually let's pick that one up, because it's an interesting question I think that we all think quite a lot about. And it's, I mean, one of the really striking things about the last 30 years is that we've had this incredible revolution in information technology. I mean, breathtaking in terms of the way we did things then, the way we do things now. And yet, hand on heart, I don't think we could say that our societies are any better informed, any more democratic than they were 30 years ago. So on one level, that is a massive technological failure. You know, we've had this incredible technology that could have done all those things, and it didn't. So what do we need to do now to change that dynamic? Obviously, just leaving it to the technology itself isn't going to fix it. So any thoughts on that? I mean, from where you're sitting, Helge, any thoughts on how we might do that?
Well, I really think that tech has really shown us how we can make amazing products, and products that are super sticky and that are fun to use. And in the media industry where I come from a traditional newspaper, and we've always been thinking like, okay, people have to read us, whether it's in print or on web or on the mobile. Okay, it's kind of good for them. They have to read it. But you are competing with some of the most sticky and fun and most user-friendly experience on the planet. Like, have you tried not to scroll through TikTok? It's really, really hard, right? And have you tried to read like a 10,000-word piece on The Guardian? It's hard in a different way, right? And not the good kind. So I really think that we need to learn from and get inspired from these companies, and really try to build products that are so informative and so fun to use that they can maybe not compete directly against TikTok for like 2 hours of your life, but maybe every day, but maybe for like at least 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
And I guess what kind of structures do we need to create, or that perhaps you've started to create, to do that? Because up until now, the technology hasn't done that. I mean, Andrew, any thoughts about that? How do we change this dynamic that we got into, where technology has almost become a drag point on democracy rather than an enhancement of it? How can we switch that?
I was just thinking about when Helge was talking, I was just thinking that when I started to do this stuff, when we started the Clusters and Audience in the Future, I just stepped down as off the content board of Ofcom, our regulator. And at that point, they hadn't got it. They hadn't got it. There was a regulatory hole where the internet was, where everything, for any kind of subscription to any digital service and what happened to the data, and I think the regulators have started to work together, but we need to rethink this, I think quite sharply, about what it means to, you're absolutely right. I mean, these, TikTok is designed for repetition. You're the product, they want your data, it's designed to keep you scrolling. I think we'll find at some point we'll have to think about regulating that kind of thing. But I think we've got a particular problem in the UK, I think, because I think for years, and it's certainly true when I was at Ofcom, we think for years that fake news was about, we're all interested in deep fakes and, those kind of things. And, it's interesting about storytelling, how deep fake stories are told and dramas are told about deep fakes and things. But as we've seen since 2016, and perhaps a small portion of people might be starting to realise in its consequences over the last couple of weeks, we've been the subject of a deep fake story, a misinformation story for many, many years that culminated, it burst upon us with the Brexit vote. So I think we're slightly disillusioned about it, those of us who work in this field in the UK, because we've seen it roll out on a different scale. So I think definitely the tech utilities feel to be more part of the problem than they are part of the solution of the better life problem. But I think in the UK we've got some particular problems with our media mix, ownership, political allegiance, storytelling, that I think, I'm not sure there's the appetite, sadly, to look at the moment, you know.
I mean,
In a different world, this would have gone on from the Levinson inquiry and it would have changed up in a different place. Maybe that's part of what happens next. That would be great.
Okay.
Is that very depressing?
Yeah, it's quite depressing, but realistic. And what needs to happen to sort of shift that? I mean, what kinds of regulations are we thinking about here? What kinds of investments in things like public service broadcasting, which is very strong in a number of European countries, certainly Norway, also in Germany. I mean, currently our main public service broadcaster has been under a series of attacks for quite a while, rather than in a position to think about how it might expand the public sphere or work in different kinds of ways. So how do we, let's imagine, you know, a clean slate. How do we begin to turn that around?
I don't know. I think just from the research side, I'd like to see more research into what, you know, say with Facebook and Instagram, we now know there's a lot of research been sitting around about the impacts of on young women with eating disorders, and we know that they know that was there. So I think it's how do you inform through research? How do you then think about taking those insights into the political sphere? So I think that's where with the tech sector, I think the public service broadcasting is a model for the UK at the moment.
Yeah,
the BBC backed away from the internet when it could not have done 10 years ago, and we've not explored public service media on digital networks, sadly.
Yeah, whereas in Europe, potentially, there are alliances that you could create that might do that. But Helge, what are your thoughts on this? No,
I think that we can look at it as a problem, or we can look at it as a problem we can fix, or like bring a solution to the table to. And I really think that now we have so much data, all the media companies, whether it's BBC or Schibsted or Springer, we know a lot about how people are interacting with our products. And I really think that, at least in Norway, there are some companies now that are in the forefront of really wanting to create new products that fill the user's need in a better way than we're doing today. Because let's face it, a lot of the journalism that's being made, it could have been made 20 years ago. It hasn't changed. And if we take the data that we have now from how far do the users scroll down, which stories are they engaging with, for how long are they engaging, and you marry that with some of the formats and some of the technology that the tech companies have brought to the table. And I really think that you can make journalistic products that are, if not as sticky, as close to being as sticky as TikTok or Instagram. And I really think that there's a market out there for it. I think there are people who are wanting to stay informed, but don't have the time to spend an hour or two every day getting updated. They maybe have like 5 minutes between classes or after the shift as a nurse in the hospital. And then you have to have a product that really fits with their needs. And I think that's is a challenge for our industry, but it's also a huge possibility, because I would say that for a public service broadcaster, to reach those people, it's right in the heart of your mandate. And as a commercial company, you can say that, okay, quality journalism, that market is saturated. The people that are really willing to pay for a New York Times subscription or support The Guardian, there aren't getting more of those, yeah? But maybe there are some that are willing to pay a smaller amount for a product that they really feel is suited for them, and that's a possibility.
And that, of course, means questioning, I suppose, everything that we necessarily think we know about what journalism is and what news is and whose voices they are and how they're articulated. I mean, Josh and Marlen, any thoughts on this one?
The way this has sort of evolved, I thought, was a really striking parallel to the presentation two or three presentations before ours, the one on issues around journalism and the inherent inequalities within journalism, and who get the whole thing about who gets to tell their stories. And I think there's a really interesting sort of dovetailing there. People, as the speakers in that presentation were saying, there's people who get turned off because the people who are telling those stories don't look like them, don't have the experiences they have, and when their communities become this topic of stories, it's as the other rather than from their own in a more supporting perspective. And I think what you're sort of pointing to here is, maybe there's a kernel of a clue as to where this could go, as something that actually really represents people where they're coming from, and allows people to hear their stories reflected back to them in their world in a way that is supportive and sympathetic, rather than, as often tends to be the case in UK media, sort of attacking or derogatory or things like that.
So that's clearly going to be a different model, isn't it? As we heard earlier. I mean, it's a co-creation model. It's a very different way of doing things. Marlen, any thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, just quickly that if it comes to media, maybe to I'm not so pessimistic. I think if it comes to the technology and the internet, it made a lot of things much more democratic, and it depends always on the discourse of what's happening. It makes everything extremer. A couple of years ago, everyone was talking about Arab Spring and how social media enabled this democratic process. Now, if we see other countries in struggle, they're turning off social media because this would allow groups to protest and participate at the democratic process. So I'm generally not at a position where I say internet didn't bring these kind of, some of the promises that were discussed very early, but it of course also brought threats and other things that were gatekeeper. There was a gatekeeper before. The internet democratized. Everyone can do whatever they want on the internet, share their opinions and so on. And then as a new model, because you asked that in the beginning, maybe as an idea and where it's going to, I believe the traditional journalistic model as we used to have it is not working. You're not able to monetize content in the same way as you used to when you still had a printed media, something that bounded to a price. So how do we solve this? And there are different ways to think about it. Either we make journalism better, we need to rethink how much time people can spend on it, but maybe also it's part of the state's obligation to make sure we are informed and have access to information. And to bring it back to the overall creative industries, everyone knows that if it comes to theater, crafts, paintings, and all of these areas, that's highly subsidized by the state. Maybe this kind of model where we think of media, of course, independent in terms of content, being more of almost an obligation of the government funding it, could be a future model as well to go to, instead of modeling the journalism towards something that is monetizable, where I'm really skeptical about.
So information is a public good that we need to invest in as we would in any other kind of utility.
Yes, if it's a cultural good or if it's information.
So I'd like to finish with what we might call the Galwad question, which is to ask you all to imagine a world in which the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is passed everywhere and is not only passed but taken really seriously. So from this point on, all kind of governments act in a way that bears in mind the well-being of future generations. In 30 years' time, if that happened, what might, being realistic as well, what might our creative industries look like? Sorry, that's a big leap I want you all to make there. Andrew, do you want to have a crack at that first?
Oh, bloody hell. That's a pretty tough one, isn't it? I'm just trying to think of, there are inevitably going to be a few kind of slightly random thoughts. So I think the advertising industry is going to look differently. This was touched on early on, is that if the skills of the advertising industry is the architects of desire, then what seems to be mapped out in the Galwad, what's been a running kind of stream through today is a different way of living. So different desires. So I think we're going to see, if that happened, we'd see a lot less advertising for stuff, as was mentioned before. We'd see slower product cycles, I think, is a thing that's been obvious for, for years. I mean, that interconnection between advertising and, every September it's a new iPhone. Even if it's exactly the same iPhone, it's just more expensive, like the last one. There is this, that's got to slow. So I think advertising is going to look very different. I think performance is going to look different, live performance, but I'm not sure how. There seems to be a variety of, we were back at the ABBA show on the Olympic Park in London as a one-off or the start of something. It's definitely not the end. It doesn't feel like the end of something. So I think that, maybe we will see dead people eventually live performing. In fact, I know there are shows in prep now that would do that. But I think there will be a number of ways of experiences, live experiences, that will be mediated in different ways through the technology, and there will also be sweaty pubs in Camden still, I hope.
Yeah, you very much hope. Yeah.
I very much hope the Dublin Castle will still be there.
Who else would like to have a go at this sort of world-building question?
I for one really hope that there will be a media industry that has products that are freely available to anyone that need them to stay informed, and that we have seen as a society that the role that the media and the news media play is vital for our democracy. But at the same time, I hope that news media has changed from how it is today. I hope it's more inclusive. I hope it's more diverse. I hope a lot more voices are being heard, and I hope that the journalism is also much more solution-orientated than what we're seeing today.
Very succinct. You've obviously thought about this. Josh, Marlen?
I mean, I think my thought is I think what we would see in the future would be lots of things within the creative industries being much more local. I think rather than lots of big national things, it'd be a lot more about people in their communities and thinking about what a creative industries would look like that was much more focused on communities and community wealth building and the shape in which communities look after each other in a world in which people are consuming less. Then I think that the communities would the potential is community would fill a gap in that. But what would creative industries look like in a world where there's lots and lots of little communities and the creative outputs that are being generated are serving those little communities? I don't know.
Okay, it links back a bit to some of the points that Marlen was making about the kind of local and the global. Marlen, thoughts from you?
Yeah, maybe to take it from an international perspective, if you say it's everywhere and everyone pulls or pushes in the same direction, I think what is really something we can start already now, because if everyone would work in the same framework, has the same goals, there would be a lot of best practices emerging from everywhere that should be shared. Because I feel sometimes there is a solution here in Cardiff, but no one else knows about it. There's a solution in Bergen, and Cardiff industry would definitely benefit from it to be more inclusive. And we are trying this already on quite a small scale as much as it's possible right now. But if we have this overall framework that all binds us together so we can exchange this and find the best solution through trial and error everywhere, and therefore get best solutions for being more sustainable, to creating the best future for future generations, then maybe that would make a difference.
I'm intrigued by that. How might that work? I mean, have you got thoughts about, is there a technology behind that, or is it an attitude?
It's more of a framework. I see it a little bit with the Sustainable Development Goals, which are also inspiring the future. Yeah. And if I see how this is being adapted by many different organizations, and then they're sharing how they are tackling each of these Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, which is like this kind of international framework for something like a Future Generations Act, you can really get inspired how different companies from the creative sector, but also other sectors, can tackle that. And something that I see as well is that I think in a future that I could imagine it's much more cross-sector collaboration, or even getting away of some of the sectors where companies really go across activities all of the time and then learn from each other and from different companies and sectors. So for me, it's exchange. That could be something that really makes a big difference in the future.
That's a fantastically optimistic set of thoughts to end on. Huge thanks to the panel, Andrew, Helge, Josh, Marlen, and I think we've got one more panel, I think, to follow. But yeah, thanks to the panel.